I'm attached to a research project which is called the Migration of Faith, Clerical Exile in late antiquity. Now, my own work focuses on the early medieval period, which means I'm examining exile in the various kingdoms that replaced the Western Roman Empire. And these kingdoms were established by several so-called barbarian groups who moved into Western Europe around at the turn of the 4th century. And over the next 100 years, through a combination of conquest and diplomacy, they sort of carved out their own independent kingdoms. So here you can see a map of Europe in around 500 CE, which depicts some of these kingdoms. So, for example, you've got the Franks in northern Gaul, you've got the Visigoths in southern Gaul and Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the particular group that I'm interested in today, which is the Vandals in North Africa. But I just want to start off to talk a bit more about the phenomenon of exile. So in the early medieval period, much like today, the term exile could be applied to anyone who had been forced to leave their homeland. So of course, that includes what people would think of as refugees, so persons who have been displaced by warfare or persecution or natural disasters. However, my thesis focuses on a different type of exile. So that's exile as a sort of form of punishment imposed by the state. And this phenomenon doesn't really exist in 21st century Britain. I guess the kind of closest parallel we have is the deportation of foreign nationals, but that really isn't a criminal penalty. But in the fairly recent past, sentences of exile were handed out by British courts. So think about the transportation of convicts to Australia, which only really ended in the sort of mid-19th century. Now today I want to focus on or sort of showcase a specific approach that I've adopted in my thesis, and that's using digital mapping techniques to discern some of the reasons why that barbarian kings exiled their subjects. And with time being limited, I'm going to focus on one particular kingdom, Vandal North Africa, as I said. Now in the past, historians usually associated the application of exile in Vandal North Africa with religious persecution. And this is because the Vandals were so-called Arian Christians, which was a heresy that denied the equality of the Trinity. So God the Son, i.e. Christ, was seen as inferior to God the Father. Now, according to the contemporary sources, so stuff written at the time, the Vandals were highly intolerant of Catholic Christianity and tended to establish religious conformity by exiling thousands of Catholic Christians. However, in the sort of last decade, scholars have begun to question that narrative of religious persecution, suggesting that our sources, which were usually written by Catholic clerics, may have exaggerated the levels of religious hostility. So part of my research, I've been examining how far these sort of revisionist arguments are supported by the geography of exile. So on this slide, you can see the known movements of every individual or group of individuals who are exiled by Vandal authorities in the 5th century. So what sort of things can we draw from this image? Well, actually not that much at all. As you can see, it's just a bit of a jumble of arrows. What you kind of need to do is we need to incorporate another dimension, which is change over time. So if we look at this graph of recorded exile cases, you can see that there's a sort of initial burst of exile following a gap of documented cases in the middle years, and then a second more significant burst towards the end of the 5th century in the 480s and the 490s. So if we create two separate maps reflecting this chronological development, as you can see that the two bursts of exile, they actually produce very different geographical profiles. And I've summarized some of the differences. So early in the century, it was eastwards. They were going to Italy, the Eastern Mediterranean. It was long distance. Whilst after 480, there was more movement. It was movement north and south. They were going to closer places, so the Mediterranean islands and the desert interior. So those are the two different profiles. So how can we sort of account for this change? Well, if we have a closer look at exile prior to 450, so on this map, I've added a layer in red, which shows the sort of early extent of the Vandal kingdom. Now, as you can see, all the instances of exile can be characterized as external, so with individuals moving out of the Vandal kingdom to Italy or to the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, this suggests that the Vandal authorities didn't really control the exile movement. It was more sort of expulsions from the kingdom. And whilst it could represent maybe individuals fleeing from religious conflict, it's not likely to represent that coherent policy of state persecution that I alluded to earlier. If that was the case, we would expect a sort of different geographical profile. In particular, we'd expect exile to be internal, as that would have sort of allowed the Vandal authorities to police the movements of these clerics and other Christians and to limit their influence. So I'd suggest instead that maybe exile in this period should be linked to the Vandal settlement. So after conquering Roman Africa, present-day Tunisia and Algeria and Libya, the Vandal king was required to reward his followers with allotments of land, which was, the best source of capital in the ancient world. And such land obviously had to be confiscated from somebody, and that was the native inhabitants. So I'd say to facilitate this process, the Vandal king seems to have expelled some of the major landowners of this region, in the region around Carthage. So on this map, I've traced the movements of these aristocratic exiles, and they're sort of likely to have been the sort of very wealthiest African families. You could call them the sort of Roman 1%. And they all ended up in either Italy or the Eastern Mediterranean. And significantly, these two regions were still part of the Roman Empire at this time. In fact, two of the destinations, so Ravenna in northern Italy and Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, they were the epicenters of imperial power where the emperors held court. So what we see here then is movement away from the newly established Vandal kingdom towards these more relatively stable areas, still subject to Roman authority. And taken together, all this evidence suggests that this burst of exile was precipitated by the Vandal settlement and the confiscation of land in this area around Carthage. So if we move to this second period of exile in the 480s, again we see this very different map with a different geographical profile. Once again, the red area represents the extent of the Vandal kingdom, which had been expanded over the course of the 5th century, eastwards, and westwards, and also they'd occupied some of these Mediterranean islands. And also the yellow layer to the south, that represents the Berber tribes of the desert interior. And these are sort of semi-autonomous, but they also seem to have recognised Vandal authority. So in stark contrast to the earlier period, exile was overwhelmingly internal. So individuals were moving to locations within the boundaries of the kingdom. So after researching the identities of these exiles, I've found that the majority were actually Catholic clerics. And on this map, I trace the movements of these clerical exiles. Now, this would seem to suggest that in this period at least, there was a persecution of the Catholic Church. If you look at the pattern of movement, you'll see that the clerics were really being sent to these peripheral areas, so the desert interior or Mediterranean islands, especially Corsica. That seems to have been the sort of most popular place of banishment. So this suggests that, unlike in the earlier period, which was expulsions from the kingdom, the Vandal king was now sort of assigning specific sites on the frontiers of his kingdom that could act as places of exile. In other words, he was controlling the movement. And we know that in these places, the clerics were kept under close supervision. For instance, the ones who were banished to Corsica, the most northern island, they were said to have been put to work cutting timber for the king's ships. So these locations were kind of acting as penal colonies, similar in function to the gulags of Siberia, for instance. So we can say with some confidence that exile was being used to punish religious dissidents and was perhaps also being used as a tool of coercion. So the king was attempting to encourage these Catholic clerics to convert to his own faith by sending them to banishment in these remote, pretty unpleasant areas. Okay, so wrapping up the brief talk today, I've focused on one of the approaches that I've kind of adopted in my thesis, which uses the geography of exile to provide insight into the sort of circumstances behind the application of the penalty. And using Vandal Africa as a case study, we've seen how the application of exile in two different time periods produced two very different geographical profiles. So one where exile was used to facilitate the confiscation of property and wealth, and another where exile was used against Catholic clerics as part of a religious persecution. So if you're interested in finding anything more about the project or my PhD, we've actually got a stand upstairs and I've got a poster sort of going through this. But for now, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.